Welcome to session 6 of European Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Stanford Engineering. My name is Burton Lee. I'm the course instructor. Today we're going to be focusing on Switzerland and Turkey, on venture capital and product design in both countries with two speakers. One of them a Stanford alum out of Geneva, Giuseppe Zocco, managing partner, co-founding partner of Index Ventures, and Emrah Yalaz of String Ventures based in Istanbul and San Francisco. Okay? Emrah is our first Turkish speaker. He'll be talking about the Turkish startup and venture capital ecosystem. I'm pleased to welcome Giuseppe Zocco, also a Stanford GSB alum, and you are head of the Swiss Alumni Club for Stanford. Is that correct?
That's right.
Giuseppe, welcome to Stanford Engineering.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, you're very privileged. I'm a little jealous to see you in a position where I was almost 20 years ago. This is my 20th year reunion, actually. Almost unbelievable. It's a privileged point of view in terms of what you're learning, but also the experience you have from people that have started companies that are creating the future of technology, that are innovating at different levels. And when you go back to your countries, I assume some of you are not necessarily from the 650 area code, will bring with you this DNA and this activity and this passion. And so it's a real privilege to be here, and also I think an obligation to continue drive that entrepreneurship and that innovation spirit in other geographies. So when we started Index, and I think we'll have a very brief view here about what we have done, just to give you an idea of what a venture firm could do in a European-centric environment. We all had, most of the funding partners had experience in the US, and particularly in this campus, and we were really passionate about what the VCs had done in this country in the late 60s when they were traveling from San Francisco, creating Silicon Valley, Sand Hill 3000, the building that assembled, a couple of hundred of these investors, was the first nucleus of this activity. And our mission was to bring the California model of venture investing to Europe. That was the idea. So you've seen from the map that Burton showed before that Switzerland is kind of the center of that European continent, and we consider Europe as a region that includes Israel and Turkey and other kind of neighboring area, Eastern Europe, Western Europe. That European region, the idea was to cover that from Switzerland, and the idea was that much like we'd seen in the US, European entrepreneurs will get together with the right funding, with the right backing, which is beyond capital, but also skills and network, could create significant companies. So when we started Index, the idea was to go from Geneva into other important areas. Now London is our biggest office, actually. We have about 12 investors there. About half our investors are in London. About a third or so are in Geneva, and then the rest is in San Francisco. We have now 13 partners, 2 permanently based in San Francisco, 4 in Geneva, and the rest in London. And we're really active across the board in multiple areas. Europe, unlike the US, is not really polarized. Arguably, the US, have Silicon Valley, and maybe Boston, Route 128 is a second pocket, but mainly Silicon Valley. In Europe, you have to go to different hubs. And be it in a certain sector, Scandinavia or the UK or Germany, you can identify the leading pockets of innovation, and they're dispersed. They're not concentrated in one particular place. So you have to cover a lot of geographies. One of the things that we have done over the period of time since we've been active is really creating companies that are global in their ambition, not just looking at the European market, but looking at what they could do from that basis. Now we have about 120 active companies in portfolio. About 2/3 of those are actually in Europe, and about 1/3 is in the US. When they're US companies, obviously they have an angle that brings them to Europe. And very briefly, we organize our activity in 3 areas. We think about the seed area, we'll talk more about that, but sort of the initial thinking and what matures in terms of business plan with an opportunity and an embryonic team, sometimes 1 or 2 people. Then we have the startup, really getting the resources to get going and creating significant company, going from the concept to the real innovation, the product, the service to market. And then the third phase, what we call the growth, the acceleration, something that's already proven that works, but it's still at a relatively small scale, oftentimes, tens of millions of activity in terms of sales or revenues, and they could go to hundreds. So the second cycle of growth, which is very important, particularly for European companies, where oftentimes the startups don't get to that second level of growth, but they remain relatively small, and sometimes they're sold too early, unlike their US counterparts that go and expand much more quickly to a larger scale. So with that in mind, the idea was to create a network that could allow entrepreneurs to flourish from their European bases, particularly relevant for this class, or from their US bases coming to Europe, but let's say from their European bases, building category leaders. A category for us is a subsector or a submarket that is identified with one particular service or product, and the leader typically, historically, has captured most of the value of that segment. So if you're in mobile games or if you're in particular type of software, if you're the leader in that category, then you command a premium. So if you're on voice over IP and you're Skype, most of the activities around your platform, the liquidity gives you value, and you reinforce that momentum to create even more leadership. And that's a category leader. By the way, European category leader started from Eastern Europe. They took leadership on a global level. When we talk about US companies, we look at companies that have international potential, not necessarily domestic player, but players that have a pan-European strategy as part of their growth strategy. And oftentimes these regional heroes, we call them, are already starting with this global vision from the early days. When MySQL was started in Scandinavia, their idea was not to become a dominant player in Scandinavia or in Europe, but was actually very simple. Martin Mikos, the CEO, was telling us from the beginning, my idea is to take a multi-billion-dollar market, $9 billion market at the time, which Oracle was dominating, make it a $3 billion market, and have the largest chunk of that market by completely disrupting the global scene. So those are the kind of companies that we look for. It could be a combination of unique technology, but that's not enough, and the right team, the right market, the right, what we call missionary, meaning not just going after money, mercenary, but missionary wanting to change a category. For example, Zendesk that was mentioned before, make it so simple, so intuitive, so beautiful as a software tool to service your customers in the after-sales process. It's more than just creating economic value. It's actually redefining a category and bringing it to the next level. So we talked a little bit about seed because obviously in the Valley, everybody's familiar with the angel activity and the seed activity. And in Europe, that's something that was a little bit lagging behind. We didn't have a lot of a seed activity. But I would say in the last few years, we have actually seen a lot more activity at the very early days where investors and entrepreneurs come together. There are numbers of angels that are obviously smaller than in the Valley, but nevertheless, there are groups that get organized in Cambridge. There's the Cambridge Angels. There are angels around Berlin. There are seed activities by funds. We, for example, have started 5 years ago a very important seed activity. And that is taking what we call the place of Series A in the sense of creating the right company from the get-go at the seed level. For a healthy ecosystem, this is a very important point because you have to create the environment and make the company successful very rapidly. Today in technology, particularly if you want to be a leader in a new emerging category, you have to very quickly get going with the right combination of investors, team, and other partners that propel you to the leadership. An example is the Climate Corporation. I don't know how many of you know the Climate Corporation, maybe the few that have heard my prior talk a few weeks ago at the GSB, but it's a company that was actually created with the idea of disrupting completely the insurance market for farming, of all places, and the idea of taking insurance against the climate and the weather, adverse weather. If there is too much rain, too little rain, if there is too much snow, any adverse events, they actually built enough of a database to be able to price on the spot through their website the appropriate value of that risk and allow farmers or other businesses that were exposed to climate risk to insure themselves. That's an example of a company that we seeded with other partners and very quickly became the leader. And Monsanto bought the company for over $1 billion a few months ago to make it really the standard in that category. But there are also a number of other models. There's a model called Seed Camp that we helped start way back that helps students in university undergrads to develop a project and not encourage them to drop out, but once they finish school, then they would get and start their company with a small investment and a foundation to start a seed project. There are many others, as you know, ways of funding. Kickstarter here is very well popular. Funding Circle is one of our companies that helps actually young companies to raise debt as well as equity. And so this is all happening in Europe in the last 4 or 5 years, allowing companies to become very solid from the beginning with the good seed starting. And if you look at the technology impact, it really spans every sector of the economy. This is a welcome news, particularly from a Europe perspective, where a lot of companies didn't find the right resources or the right platforms, not just the capital, but also particularly the executive talent to become significant very rapidly. And their US competitors very often became more powerful more quickly, and they became too much of a hurdle. I think in the later years, you're seeing a lot of companies being able to leverage platforms such as online platforms or the cloud or resources that are actually fungible, like the Amazon Web Services platform, that allows them to scale very rapidly, very quickly, even from a remote location like Denmark or southern of Spain, and become really a structure that can globally support a large business. Particularly if you look at sectors like financial services or education or fashion, a lot of that innovation is becoming from European-based companies. In fashion, arguably, the most innovative online companies are the ASOS of this world, the Net-a-Porter of this world, the Farfetch, companies that have actually created a standard of service and capabilities that are followed in many ways by US competitors. And obviously, technology is not borders, so once you become competitive in one area, you have to expand very rapidly to other areas. So today you can buy on ASOS, which is a UK-based site, by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The next morning, the goods are actually free of customs in New York, and within the day, you get them wherever you are in the US. So you have next day service, or sometimes a day and a half in the US, directly served from the UK. So there's been a lot of compenetration and a lot of diffusion of this technology innovation in all sectors of economy. If you look at one example of how European difficult markets and the recession countries have actually supported startups, you could say, well, it's really doomed for, it's not a good environment, and it's prone to failure, and it's not necessarily a fertile ground for startups. So we did an exercise. We just looked at our portfolio companies for simplicity. We put together the companies that we had created in Europe and collated all the revenues together as if it were a holding company. And it's about 20 of those companies. And those companies that are of a certain size to have revenues are typically medium or later stage companies. When you put them together, they have an average size of about 40, 50 million, depending. So they're not huge companies, but they're still not very small. And even from that basis, last year they grew 75%. So a company that was already 100 million went to 175 in a European environment which is very recession prone and so on. So just the creation of activity and the creation of jobs shows that this is a way that economies can embrace for development and for the future. So a lot of countries now in Europe have understood that. A lot of governments have created policies. You probably talked about this in the prior classes. Today, I think it's almost as efficient, as easy to create a company in Europe as it is in the US. It's not quite the same as being in Palo Alto, but it's certainly a very good, favorable environment. And if you look at the US venture industry, this is actually a famous way of looking at how the companies have created wealth and economic value over time. And these are just over the last few years, companies that have achieved over $1 billion in value. It's called a unicorn because of this particular shape. And a lot of those companies have been created using a platform that is now available to European companies as well. Those are just the US-based one. A number of companies that we're familiar with and that you have seen here are represented there. If you look at the phenomenon that has created those companies in Europe, we call them the European unicorns. In the last 3-4 years, you have seen actually an acceleration of those type of companies that have created scale. And if you look at just the last 12 months, for example, IPOs of companies like Criteo, which we talk about here briefly, is a company that does online retargeting for advertising that allows you to really target your audience with a very specific advertising message. And so you select on the fly what ad to display to which visitor of your site based on their history of clicking before, without knowing anything about their demographic. You don't know if they're young or old, if they're men or women, but just because of their clicking behavior, you can actually get a much more relevant ad served to the right person, resulting in a multi-fold increase in conversion rate. So this company went public last year in NASDAQ, is today a multi-billion-dollar company out of France, really leading globally that category from their French roots. Obviously now they have also a New York and a Palo Alto base. Another example is Supercell, which is super unicorn, if you will, because in a short period of 2 years, the company went from the idea of reinventing video games, essentially, leveraging the iOS platform, instead of developing like Electronic Arts does for a year and a half or 2 years, a game that's ready for your console, for your Xbox or for your PS3, which takes tens of millions and hundreds of developers. The idea was very simple, hence the name. You take a small unit, a cell, that has super focus on one particular game over a period of months, few people, sort of the platoon concept instead of the army concept. They would create a platform-specific game, so only for iPad. So now the complexity is much reduced. You launch it, and then we're talking about 10, 20 people will develop the game over time. And because of the very rapid adoption of the mobile platform, this company has generated very, very significant revenues. And two of the games, Clash of Clans and Heyday, you probably know, are in the top 3 on the Apple platform. Actually, since their launch, very recently went up there and they stayed there. Another company in Italy, actually it's an Italian founder, UK-based company. Again, in this gaming industry, a company called King that last year announced their intention to go public has created this game that it's called Candy Crush, that many of you have probably played with, where you take candies and you put them aligned, and if you're good enough, you go to different levels. Again, in that category, they've been able to create global leadership on that particular segment very rapidly and maintain it for a long period of time. So these are all examples of companies that are very large, and we could talk about a number of others that are filing for IPOs that have been bought or will be bought in the next few months.
Giuseppe, where's Criteo out of?
Criteo was out of Paris,
so France,
French company.
Supercell is
Finnish company,
Yep.
kind of the Nokia wireless environment. King, we said, some Italian from Rome and some UK-based entrepreneurs. And so, what this tells us is that, when you're really thinking big and you take the risk of pushing a company forward as much as it could, you can get rewards. And the thinking is very different from the typical sort of, what could be wrong in this investment? What are the typical risks that can bring the company down? You have to think about the other side of a risk, which typically in an investment is symmetric. What could be the upside of this? And that's the main reason why we invested in Skype, is because although there were many, many red flags, the founders couldn't even travel to the US. They were the Kazaa founders that had a number of issues with them, and legal and other issues, but they were brilliant technologists, and they had figured out a way to make voice over IP work really well, very little latency, by doing what they call the supernode. They managed the internet and the network in a way that nobody had been able to. And remember, this was the 12th or 13th voice over IP company. There was Net2Phone that went public, there was Vonage, there were so many, but they were the first ones to really crack the technology in a way that was user-friendly. And they became a very rapidly global leader. When we invested, they had 9 million downloads, and they very quickly surpassed the 100 million downloads within the year and a half. So thinking about what could go right was the main reason why we ended up investing in Skype. That means that when you think about innovation capability of the new team, you cannot take a factor 10 or a factor 15 as a good metric. You have to think about innovating on various axes simultaneously, so that if you fail, if you reach even half of your innovation, each one of them, your compounded result is a very disruptive company, a very, very powerful innovation. And that's where you think about what could go right in terms of multiple axes of innovation working at the same time. This is very simply translated into success rates. This is a curve that represents where the returns are coming in a typical venture portfolio, and ours are very similar to this, where one or two successful companies on the vertical axis generate most of the return, and then as you accumulate the number of additional companies in the investment portfolio, they don't add that much. So you have to go to the really big ones. Again, the Supercell, the MySQLs, the Playfish, and so on. Now, some people ask us, if you go to Cambridge in the UK, you go to Munich, or Paris, is that it? Actually, Europe is a very complex environment, very difficult to say. There is no Silicon Valley. There is not one single place. There are actually pockets of innovation, typically layered by technology. So if it's wireless, it's probably Finland, a little bit in Sweden, it's Cambridge, and it's Munich. If it's software, it's probably Paris, it's Munich. There are different pockets for different categories. If it's SaaS, there's actually a lot of innovation in Copenhagen. There is something in the Netherlands. Obviously, the UK tends to be a big chunk of the European innovation, we'll see later, and Scandinavian, but there are also other areas around it. So you have to turn a lot of stones. You have to do a lot of seed deals in different geographies to cover it well. And then think about becoming very global very quickly, which is something that many European countries have done by default. If you're a Dutch producer of a service, you have to go global because you don't have a lot of domestic market. Similarly, if you're a software developer in Estonia, or if you're in Israel. So this is part of the DNA in Europe from the beginning. Burton has asked me to think a little bit about how Europe compares to the US, so a few numbers to give you an idea. The US is obviously much larger. You think about 8 to 10 times in terms of invested amount. On the left, you have the VC investments last year, $5 billion in Europe, over 30 in North America. If you think about number of deals, number of investments, 2012, 2013, very similar story, multifold. But however, Europe, if you look at the number of deals, for example, even though it's 4 times less and 5, 6 times less in amounts, they're still capable of producing those great companies that we all like, the multi-billion-dollar companies. And so the encouragement here for all of you who are interested in that part of the world is to not think, in a limited way, but to think globally. If you start a great company, regardless of your geography, you have to think about winning against everybody else, the Asian competitors, the US competitors. And Europe has created a number of those. If you look at how the growth has actually developed over the last few years, some of which are really difficult years, particularly in Europe, as you know, the twofold increase in Europe versus doubling in the US is somewhat encouraging, of course, from a smaller base. But it gives you a little feeling for the momentum. Then you look at the investment across stages. If you get rid of the last two, which are more kind of private equity type, very, very late stage investments, all the rest is an area where we play routinely, and that's the core of our business. Probably between 1 million and 25 million is where it all concentrates. You see not huge number of deals, but still quite significant. And then finally, when you think about geographies, the dispersion, as I mentioned, around the UK is typically about 40% of the deal flow in Europe is the UK. About another 20-25% is Scandinavia as a whole. Here you have Sweden split from the rest, but if you put Sweden and Denmark together, those are number 2 typically. Then Germany is number 3, typically 15-20%. Israel, actually, which is not in this particular definition, but it's in our definition, that would be also typically another 20% of deal flow in the European region. And then you have all the rest. Then you have France, Russia, all the rest. So it gives you an idea. You cannot be focused on one country, let alone one area code. 650 this is a luxury that only few of our local colleagues have. In Europe, you really have to go wide. And so finally, a few words about what type of interesting models work in Europe. Not very different from the US, by the way. There are really 3 ways to create significant value. One is to attack and destroy, MySQL type, destroy a $9 billion market and try and capture most of it by making it open source. Whatever Oracle does for 100, we'll sell for 10, but we'll do many more of those. And the cost structure is in a way that really disrupts the incumbents in a way that they cannot respond very easily. The second way is the opposite, is make your product or service really much more required by the incumbents for their efficiency and for their continuing their prosperity, so that you become a mission critical part of the value chain for the incumbents. You're not destroying them, you're actually creating value for them. And then finally, the third, which is the toughest, admittedly, is the new market. This is the Supercell story, right? There is no iPad, there is no mobile gaming. In the space of 3 years, you create multi-hundreds of millions of dollars of value because there's a new market that and by the way, it's not just Supercell, but it's, you have Rovio with the Angry Birds and a number of others. And so that new market didn't exist, a few years ago. And there'll be quite a few of those as you see the new platform developing, whether it's phone, iOS, Android, whether it's tablets and other connected TVs is another interesting market. So I would leave you with one final sort of thought, which is, obviously we talked about what could go right, how to think about risk, but very importantly is one of the biggest risks, particularly, Stanford audiences, well-educated, energetic, ambitious young people. I think if you try something new and it fails quickly, that's not a big, assuming you fail for the right reason, It's not every failure is a blessing, because if you're negligent or if you didn't try hard or whatever, it's not good. But if you do, all you have to do when you learn and you work well, you work hard with your team, failure is not a problem. The sooner it comes, the better it is, because the worst thing is that you get stuck for 5 or 10 years of your career into something that goes nowhere. It's sort of a $5-10 million business. It doesn't grow. It's not a leader, but it's still okay, and becomes a lifestyle business. And a lot of capital is actually going to chase situations that are not very hyper growth, but they're actually situations that are sort of cash flow, and that's more of a private equity situation that we don't particularly like. We like growth, and we like innovation that drives very, very significant top line growth of revenues, bigger businesses. And think about the fact that your innovation shouldn't be per se a sort of a beautiful new service, but should have some kind of snowball effect if possible. Skype allows a lot of new innovation in the call center. Zendesk allows innovation in terms of customer service and how you actually make an after-sales service a moment where you reinforce your customer appreciation for your service, and therefore you increase the value of a regional sale. And a number of those innovations have this enabling power, enabling effect that multiplies the value to the user. And with that part, you become a lot bigger in terms of potential final value. I would leave one more thought with this sort of risk. And I remember when I was actually in business school here across the road, one of our class, a similar class, was sort of encouraging students to become entrepreneurs, which is something I've always embraced and loved. And it was Irv Grousbeck, one of the professors there, said, okay, think about risk this way. If you are an entrepreneur at Stanford, and there were long statistics with all these students, you have a certain risk of failing. If you go to McKinsey, you have a chance in 13 to become a director. If you go to Goldman Sachs, you have a chance in 15 to become a senior partner. Guess what the chances are to succeed as a Stanford-bred entrepreneur? About 50%. So 50% of the startups that start with Stanford DNA succeed and 50 fail. For some people, it's still high risk, but those are not entrepreneurs. For an entrepreneur, those are phenomenal numbers. If you have 50% chance of succeeding, it's a great, and I have to say in a lot of our companies I'm using Stanford as an example. It could also be MIT, it could be Harvard, it could be any of those great schools where you have the technical knowledge, you have the drive, you have the IQ and the desire to succeed. This is not so risky as it may look from the outside. So I would encourage you to go and push forward, and I think Burton with this class does a very great job of instilling this desire in you. And if you have Europe as a territory, and we'll hear more about Turkey, but there are opportunities everywhere, regardless of the geography. So I would leave you with this positive message.
Short Q&A.
Okay.
So Giuseppe, thank you. So your slide where you showed basically the breakout of venture investment and deals by country was very persuasive for a pan-European strategy. Why don't we see more pan-European venture funds and venture firms? Most of the venture funds we see, including some who speak here, are very country-specific or region-specific.
I think the key, it's a very good question, because the key is actually the relevant network. And the network is really on two sides. On the deal flow side, it's very hard to build a deal flow outside your country. And on the value-added side, after you invest, to add value to these companies, you need to have a relevant network of entrepreneurs that are like-minded, or corporate partners could be partners. And so it takes time to be creating this pan-European network. And for us, was a strategy from the beginning. But it's a lot easier to be a French fund in Paris and a German fund in Munich and a Scandinavian fund in Stockholm, because your network, and particularly in an early stage situation, you could create an environment that's easier to manage and easier to get started. There are a handful of pan-European funds. Our friends from Excel and Burton and others have created at pan-European level, but it's not as easy. Arguably, we're not quite there, but if you had 3 to 5 funds for each of the big countries, and then 5 to 7 pan-European, you probably have all you need. We're probably halfway through that development. And so a lot of it we had to do ourselves. So for example, the seed activity in Eastern Europe is not the easiest thing to do, but we do it consciously, because we want to jumpstart the ecosystem. And hopefully one day there'll be more locally, and we can just help the companies then go to the next level.
Okay. Questions? Yes, sir.
Very impressive, Dr. Maker. You showed some numbers of your portfolio. Can you tell us what would be a typical investment? I mean, the size, how long do you keep them, and what is the stake you take in those companies?
So there are 3 pockets, right? So the seed is typically a few $100,000, less than $1 million. They typically last for 1 to 2 years, so that the company proves whatever they had to prove. We agree, right? The proof could be dollars, euros. Not too different. In these days, it'll be converging very soon. We're talking dollars in this case for this audience. Then Series A is usually a few millions, 3 to 5. They would last for the first step until Series B. That's typically a 2-year window, and that typically takes you to a milestone that's significant enough to raise a Series B. So typically it's a product launch or some important step, initial revenues potentially. Then we have growth, which, as I said, is actually accelerating something that works. So typically these companies have already a few years of activity. They have 25 million run rate. They've accomplished something that they're satisfied with. They could probably sell the company for 100, 200 million to a buyer, but they actually see that there is opportunity, and we, with them, encourage them to think bigger and try to go from the 30 million to the 300 million in the next 3 to 5 years. And so that's the acceleration phase where we could help the founders de-risk. Maybe they take 1 or 2 million off the table so they can buy their house, they can relax a little, but they can also maintain the high risk propension that makes them go for the next big goal. And financial resources, but also the network helps them then become global, internationalize the business. So typically the challenge are different. At seed level, you have to prove a concept. At the startup, you have to actually bring the concept to market, and with the growth, you have to accelerate to go internationally. And that the growth investment is typically 20, 25 million, 3 to 5 years to go and grow the business.
Question?
You're an investor in the family, which brings businesses from like the stage 0 to 1, and seed gap, which brings businesses from like 1 to 10. What is your view on the whole landscape of incubators in Europe, which is shifting a lot and growing quite a bit as well?
Well, I think it's a welcome part of the ecosystem, right? You have incubators that are of various types. They are called with the same name, but there are the ones that just give you the desk and the phone line and the internet access, and they're more kind of facility providers, and maybe a coach or two. There are others that give you That plus, mentors and other entrepreneurs and a network. And then there are others that are actually entrepreneurs themselves that call themselves angels or super angels that start working with a number of young entrepreneurs under their wings. And then there is the seed funds, like ours and a few and others, that will actually institutionalize that activity. So I think it really depends a lot on what you get. As an entrepreneur, sometimes you don't have the experience to know what you're looking for, so you kind of read incubator, you go there and you find some kind of state-sponsored building with a couple of, facilitating, office supplies and a secretary to answer the phone. That's not so helpful, actually. What is really important is understanding how your business plan should be redirected towards the core of the value proposition. How do you get the right partners interested, whether it's financial partners or operating, corporate partners, how to recruit the right people, who's the best headhunter for this particular CTO job, who else in the network can actually coach this particular CEO because they've done it before. And so that level of complexity typically requires a bit more of an organization or more experience, people that have done it for a while. So one has to be a bit careful. But in general, as I was saying before, this early stage activity has really grown in Europe. Berlin is very hot right now. There are a number of areas around Germany and France. It used to be Cambridge, now it's also London. So it's quite interesting, quite exciting times.
So we're going to bring Giuseppe again back up at the end of Emrah's talk. Giuseppe, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now we're shifting from Switzerland to Turkey. Emrah is our first speaker out of Turkey. He's going to bring us up to date on what's happening in the Turkish startup and venture capital ecosystem. And part of what makes him interesting from my perspective, coming out of mechanical engineering product design, is he's pioneering a new concept of essentially venture fund with product design consultancy competencies. We have some funds here in the Valley that have brought in designers in residence in the last couple of years, but we don't yet see this in Europe. This is really one of the first funds I've seen being raised in Europe that tries to bring design and the venture finance together at the start. So thank you for your oversight of Istanbul and for coming all the way.
Thank you. Hello there, I'm Emrah. I'm an adult, so every once in a while I curse. You're gonna, forgive me. Opposite to Giuseppe's experience and the presentation, I'm a beginner. We just started in December, and we have sharp ideas about what works and what doesn't in shallow ecosystems, and we're willing to experiment on it. So I'm going to tell you what I did. I went to undergrad in Istanbul, came here for a master's degree. Instead of going to a PhD, I joined a very small company in Chicago. They said, hey, there is this product that we have, we're kind of making money off of it. There is this idea that we have no clients, no traction, 8 months of money, are you in? And I said, okay. And we didn't know what we were doing back then. Now it's called big data analytics. In a period of over 11 years, I worked there. After third year, we became a monopoly in mortgages. After sixth year, we signed up every bank that you can name, including World Bank and Goldman Sachs. We were basically solving very, very difficult math problems for banks. And I was the first guy in products. And when I was done in 2009, we were about 300 people with 3 offices and room full of quants and whatnot. My competitive advantage there was to go underutilized universities and hire bored PhD students who figured 2-3 years into the program that academia is not for them. My best playing grounds were schools like Moscow's Institute of Science and Technology. Anybody from there? No. Go to a physics department and hire anybody. So after 11 years in 2009, I sold everything I had in Chicago, bought a motorcycle, rode around the country, and ended up here after a year. I started advising startups here because over those 11 years, I took some McKinsey techniques and jammed them to the agile and lean techniques that were coming up in Chicago. Ken Speck and Ken Schwaber were coming to Chicago, and Adaptive Path was kind of talking about new concepts in 98, 99. So that kind of worked well. I ended up training about 400 software engineers over those 11 years. And when I came here, I started showing that stuff to people here. That went quite well. And in 2012, I realized my knowledge base was much more valuable in Istanbul. So I started going back and kind of teaching them. And I started teaching at the Boğaziçi University, this one here, as of last year, which is a top university in Turkey, ranks at the same level as Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv University, that level, like in the top 200. As of December 2013, my partner and I, we co-founded String Ventures. We have positions in 9 startups, and I'm going to talk about how we go differently about seed funding. First, Turkey. Turkey is here. If you don't know, Burton told me, hey, put a map. Okay, there is Turkey. So that little slice here on the upper left-hand side is Europe. The rest is Asia. So 90% of Turkey is in Asia, really. It's world's 15th, Europe's 6th economy, almost 37 million internet users. Very high percentage, 5th in Europe. 33 million Facebook users, 10 million Twitter users. It's a 76 million country. Both of them are top 3 in Europe, and the numbers are increasing. So 67 million mobile users, very high percentage of mobile usage. Almost doubling year over year smartphones. Everybody's crazy about smartphones in Turkey. All right? Turkey is young compared to Europe. At String Ventures, we love Peter Drucker. Everybody who is going to be your clients or customers in 10 years are alive right now, so look at demographics. Demographic trends don't lie, they're accurate 99%. Look at Europe, the pear shape, oopsie. Look at Turkey, the nice pyramid shape, 10 to 14 age is still up and coming. And the government is actually encouraging population growth. Median age 29.3, critical mass. The economy has been growing almost 7% for the past decade, and there is money. This is Istanbul. This part on the left is Europe. This part on the east, the right is Asia. It's the only city in the world that is on 2 continents. This is where I teach, the top university in Turkey. This is where String Ventures are. If you've been to Istanbul, you've been to the city center, that's about there. That's Hagia Sophia and the old city on the bottom there. Okay? Almost nothing is happening on the east side. Top universities, Koç, and İTÜ and Boğaziçi are there. There are 180 universities in Turkey. Top 6 or 7 crank out the best engineers, design talent, and the startup material, so to say. Boğaziçi, Istanbul Technical University, Koç and Sabancı are in Istanbul, right there. The 2, ODTÜ and Bilkent, are in Ankara. This is the distribution of wealth in Turkey. Dark is good. Basically, between Istanbul and Ankara is most of the commerce, a lot of agriculture. Most of your cotton is coming from here. Tourism, some other stuff. There are more than 20 accelerators and incubators in Turkey. Once the startup bubble in Silicon Valley started bubbling up, it's a good bubble, everybody started copying the Y Combinator model, or they thought so. A lot of them are associated with universities, like METÜ is the Middle East Technical University. The oldest one is Girişim Fabrikası. İTOM is the ecosystem builder, the center for startups, so to say. So some of them are, familiar names, founder institutes. And the seed activity has been dominated by this guy, Hasan Aslanova. He built up a water business and sold it to Nestle for an undisclosed amount that is rumored about to be about $1 billion. He just started a Aslanova Capital seed fund. In 2002, there were fewer than 200 angels invested about $10 million. Last year, Aslanova himself invested in $38 million, about 4-fold increase. Seeing that, Turkish government jumped in and said, hey, if you're a certified angel investor now, your investment is 75% tax deductible, which is the highest rate in Europe. That basically created a rush. There's a rush for becoming a certified angel investor in Turkey. By the end of 2004, they're expecting about $600 and $200 million seed and Series A activity. Venture capital is still dominated by the foreigners. You probably know these names: Hummingbird, Earlybird, General Atlantic. The larger deals are in social gaming. Earlybird and Hummingbird, both of them invested in Peak Games, which is number 3 game studio in the world. A lot of them are clones. Notice it says like Grubhub clone, Guild clone, Yahoo clone, so forth and so on, which is what we take an issue with and we'd like to change. Russians are coming in powerfully. Russians love Turkey for some reason. Like it's the first tourist destination for Russian tourists. And Yandex, as I will talk about, is entering Turkey very, very powerfully. There are other companies lurking, but they have not made any investments yet. Atomico, Excel Partners, and Intel Capital. Intel Capital actually has a Turkish partner, Barış Aksoy, who's been coming in and out. Is he here? No. Okay. Hello there. I don't think they have made an investment yet. They're kind of looking at things, but there's nothing announced. Yandex is making a big play in Turkey to take a big chunk out of Google's market share, and they're doing very, very well. They almost more than doubled their market share so far within 8 months, and 2014 is going to be a big year for them. They're investing in a lot of stuff. Turkish VCs are playing catch-up. iLab and 212 are the Series A VCs, so to say. The investments are around $1 million to $2.5 million. iLab is associated with one of the holding dynasties of Turkey. That's more conservative. It started as an incubator, then they started doing VC type of activities. Their big investment is, Gitti Gidiyor, the eBay clone. 212, by the way, the area code of Istanbul is 212, and kind of like New York. That's where the name comes from. Solvoyo is their big play. They're getting a good chunk of supply chain business in the US. They just won a huge deal from Home Depot, actually, beating out a lot of companies from Israel, from Europe, from US. So 212 is probably the marquee Turkish VC right now that is active operating in Istanbul. So here's the problem. A lot of accelerators and incubators, the foreigners and so forth and so on. Name one global Turkish tech company. I dare you. Well, you can't, because there are a lot of e-commerce activity. There's a lot, literally the original innovation, a lot of copycats. Germans started it, the Rocket Internet brothers. They came in and basically started copying all the working silicon models in Istanbul. After a while, they packed up and went. We think there are more structural problems. One is not adapting the US model for Turkey. It's a shallow ecosystem. Everybody tries to copy YC. YC model really works only for YC because they're picking from a much larger, much richer sample. They're picking from the world, really. And the people are quite uncommonly intelligent and talented. I would argue YC model doesn't even work for outfits like 500 or Founder Institute. Top YC company, they finance 563. Top one is more valuable than the 562 combined. Top two, the number 2 is 561 combined. The top 3 YC companies are more valuable than the entire accelerator ecosystem output combined. So really, there is no point in trying to play this game, we think. The accelerators and incubators are missing out on top engineering and design talent in Turkey. Why? Because there's a lot of e-commerce and boring, non-innovating copycat type of projects. And the VCs tend to be with finance backgrounds. I'm 42 years old. When I graduated from MBA, my paths were either McKinsey or Goldman, as Giuseppe mentioned. Back then, there was no startup activity. If you were really ambitious, you would go management consulting or investment banking to take over the world and get rich. The VCs in Turkey are coming from that tradition. So there are kind of no maker VCs who build something really big. That is the third point. They have not much innovation backgrounds. The investors never built something that is 10x. They've never been in a big startup experience. Or those Turkish investors who have been in that are basically not active because they're done, you know. And there's very limited connection to Silicon Valley. The Turkish investors or the ecosystem does not know how the valley operates, what they demand, and that kind of is a game breaker. So we'd like to change that. We don't think solution is an accelerator in Turkey. Accelerator is basically in Turkey, you're pulling from a shallow talent pool compared with Silicon Valley, where the immigrants all over the world are coming here. A batch process, graduated rapidly, investment frenzy at demo day, actually deserves the technical founders and the investors, I'd argue. All startups look better than they actually are during a demo day, which is not cool. Incubator, as Giuseppe mentioned, especially in Turkey, there are government subsidies as well. They give you not only a space, but also some money, such that the startup doesn't feel the pressure to turn profits. So there are a lot of zombie startups that came out of government programs. So we don't think this is the answer either. We think for shallow ecosystems like ours, the answer is kind of like a new VC model. For one, this is a personal opinion, I think within one decade, the seed financing game will become the new day trading of the bourgeois. Basically, people, instead of trading in the stock market, will be investing into seed startups via outfits like AngelList and whatnot, and they will become very, very commonplace. That means for the seeds we see, the strategy should be vertically integrated into multiple universities, come up with a value-adding proposition, and basically rotate around undertapped technical universities to get talent. That's what we'd like to do. We also think the management consulting investment banker background at VC is not going to have much to offer at the seed level. You'd have to have product design, user experience, data science, growth marketing type of know-how so that you can provide and show value from day one as well as the funds. Because writing a $100,000 check is, pretty commonplace. Money is cheap right now. And the third thing that needs to be done for a shallow ecosystem like the Turkey's is to connect to Silicon Valley. The action is here. If a company is going to get really big, $1 billion company, or God forbid, $100 million company, it has to actually come out of Istanbul or similar places and come to Silicon Valley. We do have an ambition to become a local YC prep school in Turkey, by the way. Whoops. Right there. This is not official, but we have an ambition to basically place 1 out of 5 seed startups into a YC program. We don't think there is a need to compete with them. Their acceptance rates are lower than Harvard or MIT, and we think it can be hacked. So with that, I will talk about few of our portfolio companies that are actually innovative. Here's Imcom. It's a revolutionary new furniture buying experience. These guys are from Ankara. They're using projection mapping. There is their website. Basically, there is this device. You plug it in, and from any mobile phone or from iPads, you can have a furniture out there. The projection looks at that. You can tap and change the furniture and the fabric of that, the fabric and the color of that furniture until you find the one that you like. It's not virtual, it works actually on physical furniture.
All right, is that a projector?
It's a projector and a depth sensor, and a lot of patented software. Everything runs on the cloud, very thin clients. here in the example, this part is actually this is an actual IKEA chair. The top part is projected by Imcom. This part is the actual fabric. You know? So they have been piloting. They've launched and they're almost breaking even. Post revenue. It's when you look at the customers who buy stuff via Imcom, it's like magic. It's a really, really interesting user experience, and it reduces your retail space by tenfold. You know, now you don't have to fiddle with a lot of fabric and blah blah blah. So that's one. Another one is Surfio. Surfio makes very, very large surfaces, touch or gesture controlled at 1/15 the cost. If you wanted to make the stable, touch or gesture control, there are 15 technologies. If you want the wall, there are probably 3. If you want the wall to be curved as well, there's only Surfio. Audi started with this concept of digital showrooms, opened their first one in London and then Dubai and then Beijing, and they're opening 20 more. And Mercedes and BMW is playing catch up. All the stuff is basically Surfio technology. When you enter the Audi city in London, the entire showroom responds to you while you walk around the showroom. So that's gesture control technology. Another example of the implementation is Novo Nordisk. This is the largest curved video, curved gesture and touch control video world in the world. It's 7 meters by 2.5 meters and something like that. We did that with only 6 Kinect-like cameras. It works with any depth sensor really. It could technically work with a bat, you know, if you can get the input from a bat. And there's Sigma RD. It's very advanced natural user interfaces tool builder from Istanbul. Both Surfio and Sigma RD came from Media Lab of Boğaziçi University. These guys won the CVPR last year, which is the kind of like the Oscars of computer vision. They can do hand skeleton tracking at 21 joints in real time. Microsoft and Intel and all the other PrimeSense cannot do that. There are 5 companies who are creating tools in the space in OpenAI. Now that Apple bought PrimeSense, they're probably going to crash OpenAI or remove the tools because they never open stuff for common use. All the other companies are either bought or heavily invested by Microsoft, Intel, and Apple. Sigma RT is the only independent company that has powerful and quite popular tools to power natural user interfaces. So these are the types of companies that we're interested in, not the e-commerce and the copycats and so forth and so on. And we hope to build even more examples of that. With that, I will stop my speech. Thank you.
So can we move down a little bit so that the camera captures us both? Which of the universities in Istanbul and Ankara are most engaged around entrepreneurship? Do you see students most engaged, highest numbers of new companies being formed?
There has been an explosion in number of universities in Turkey over the past 5 years. There is one that has positioned itself as the entrepreneurship university, like they Skype Steve Blank and so forth and so on. But the problem is the Turkish university system is kind of like Korean. There are 2 events, 2 exams that you have to take. You're placed, and you cannot change your major after that. So 2 days and 2 big exams kind of set up your lifetime. Therefore, the top talent is in top 6 universities. The other universities, although they are interested or focused on entrepreneurship, they're kind of getting these second level, B-level talent. And in software design and technology, there is this unspoken ugly taboo. An A+ hacker, A+ engineer is 20 to 50 times productive as A- B+ engineer. So either get one of those guys or 20 of the other guys. So it's the usual suspects, the 6 universities that I outlined: Boğaziçi, İTÜ, ODTÜ, Bilkent, Sabancı, and Koç. There's a strange dynamic. You probably know how PayPal mafia hired from the Midwest, because the Midwestern engineers had the hardcore work ethic and whatnot. They were not spoiled and they were more humble and so forth and so on. A similar thing plays out between Istanbul and Ankara. The engineers from Ankara are more technically capable, a little bit more humble. The engineers and design talent and technical talent that comes from Istanbul, they have more opportunities for themselves. Like McKinsey and Bain is trying to grab them, and they can command high salaries. So I'm seeing definitely a talent arbitrage between Ankara and Istanbul.
Questions? Yes.
Absolutely positively surprised by what you presented of this top-notch talent and companies. It seems like you put the focus on the technology.
Yeah.
At which point during the seed time do you make the companies focus on users,
From the
on
get-go.
use cases, on...
I would say from the get-go. For your first comment, it shouldn't be a surprise. It's a 76 million population country with 6 to 10 good universities in the top 200. It's a function of population. The smartest guy in China is much smarter than the entire Turkey population combined, perhaps. And the dumbest is much dumber because you're sampling from 1.3 billion. Once you're sampling from 76 million with few decent universities, you're going to get top talents. When I was teaching in Boğaziçi, there were about 30 students in my class, and they have offers from Google, Facebook, Palantir. It's just not a surprise. To your second point, we do believe in Drucker's maxim of business has two functions: innovation and marketing. If you really press, marketing is really innovation, a form of innovation. All the others are costs. So we kind of focus on the marketing side, the user experience, and the technology, the innovation sides, almost equally, I want to say. There is a Gerbowski ratio. You're supposed to split your resources 50-50 on R&D and on marketing.
So I have a follow-up question. What is the state of product design teaching today in engineering schools in Turkey?
I think that can be generalized. What is the product design teaching in engineering or in schools everywhere else but Stanford, perhaps, because Stanford is leading? In the context of computer science software, the degree is kind of like the old Yugoslavia, multiple parts jammed together that are like different parts. There is this, the mathematical part of it, and there is the history of technology part of it, but really not a strong body of knowledge in product design. I think that's kind of growing with the emergence of user experience design. The design thinking is becoming more of a scientific body of knowledge. There are about 25 degrees that you can take and call yourself a designer, but in the context of a technology product, it needs to be perhaps a little bit more narrow. That body of knowledge is not in the universities right now. It is not encapsulated, at least not in Turkish universities. It's not encapsulated. It's not packaged such that you can say, here, here are the principles, here are the successful examples, here is the way, the steps that you can take to apply it to iterate your way to a product. I think companies like Luxor in San Francisco here, they're on the cutting edge of kind of getting the science of it down. I think more of it is going to be in universities within less than a decade, within 5 years. We'll see more UX design, product design type of classes within CS or engineering degrees.
Giuseppe, could we ask you to come up too for a few minutes? So, my observation is that very few venture funds and venture firms in Europe, partners understand the importance of product design and are actively bringing in product design competencies or skills or designers in residence as part of their team. Is that an accurate assessment? What do you see across here when you see venture funds and how they approach product design as part of the competency portfolio that their companies need to?
So clearly, it's a clearly defined core competency for the companies we invest in. And a lot of our talent is looked in that way. If somebody presents a new innovation and they talk about the back end technology or what they're trying to do to go faster, bigger, but it's not from the perspective of the user, then it's not so relevant. And the most beautiful innovation, if you look at the simplicity of Skype and the design, or the simplicity of the Zendesk, even just from the graphic point of view and the interface with the client, they shows that they've thought so much and so hard about the product and the interaction that's the core. So that's very important to have that skill in the companies you invest in. Some of our partners have had that experience. One of our partners was heading marketing at Skype, for example. So there are parts of those skills in the team, but in any case, when it's not in the founding team itself, then the company itself is less interesting as an investment. So oftentimes it's a requirement of the company that's coming to present to have that DNA.
I'd like to add something to it.
Emrah.
I think it's also a byproduct of the incoming talent to computer science and EE degrees. It used to be the introverted guy, really. The design thinking requires some balance between abstract method thinking, some right brain, other than the left brain engineering type of talent. I think that is shifting around a little bit. I think that's really a very, very good trend in a way. We need a little bit more of a female thinking in engineering to really integrate design into the hardcore, technical curriculum. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and also part of it is, just to add one more thing, is best practice that you can share, because a lot of companies are so absorbed by their small part of the universe that they're working on that they cannot necessarily open their mind. So one of the things that we do, for example, now for a few years is put together all the marketing or all the CTO guys or all the sort of user interface resources across many of our companies, and they usually have this, we call them the sort of hack days. They stay together for half a day and they figure, and you can learn from a very different environment. Say, hey, that's a good way to look at it.
Question.
Yeah, my question goes to Emrah. I'd be interested in how dependent is the current emerging VC market on foreign direct investment? I mean, we've seen tremendous growth in the past decade after the IMF intervention, and foreign direct investment still plays, let's say, quite a substantial role. So.
In Turkey, you mean? No, well, some of the foreigners, early Burton, Hummingbird, they just beefed up their funds using institutional money, EBRD and whatnot. But I would say it is actually, there is sufficient capital accumulation. There are perhaps dozens, not more than, but dozens of younger entrepreneurs who had multi-hundred million, if not billion exits, such that they're willing to give back to the society in a way. There's also a generational gap. The previous generation used to just invest in real estate in Turkey because there was so much uncertainty in the economy and the sovereign uncertainty. Buy land, they stopped making that type of argument. That's shifting, so that capital is coming back to tech.
Yes, Laurent. And I'd like to identify Laurent Mieville, Head of Technology Transfer at Université Genève. Welcome to Stanford and Silicon Valley.
Thank you. Welcome. I'm also supporting entrepreneurship at the University of Geneva in Switzerland. What we've been seeing in the last few years is there's a growing number of entrepreneurs that are not looking at the high-tech, high-return, elite, big deal, and there is a growing size of entrepreneurs that want to do socially linked companies. Are you also seeing this kind of trend in your surroundings? And is that a good or bad thing? That's an open question for you guys.
I think it's going to be even better. It used to be such that the really ambitious students, high school students, who could go engineering or business, perhaps with slightly sociopathic tendencies to disrupt stuff and build, really aggressive technology, or do something aggressive in his or her life. In Turkey, they used to go business administration or econ or political science, get out, work for McKinsey and Goldman and P&G and whatnot. That's kind of shifting in Turkey. That's good. I think it's already shifted here. Like the guy or the girl who goes for computer science in Stanford typically used to go business administration in Boğaziçi in Turkey. That's shifting, and I think that's going to shift even more. And that's great.
I think we see that as one of the key drivers. A lot of our entrepreneurs are thinking about not only how do I build value in a great company, but also what's the impact on society? How do I make this a better place? And particularly, I think in Europe now, Turkey has had a very high growth number of years, but in some of the European countries where there is a bit more of a recession and some challenge, the idea of really creating something, don't go work for Siemens, don't go work for, just let's create some good companies. There is this passion we see in a lot of our entrepreneurs in sort of wanting to prove that you can, create growth and make successful development just from the entrepreneurial energy.
So I think we're going to wrap up. Giuseppe flew in from Geneva this morning, correct?
That's right.
So at about noon. So we don't want to keep him up too late.
That's okay.
Thank you for coming all the way from Switzerland. We appreciate your spending some time with us here at Stanford Engineering School.
Thank you.
Emrah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next week's session will be featuring Flanders and Sweden. We invite you to come down and network with our speakers. Flanders is one of Europe's top regions, excellent universities, startups, accelerators. Switzerland and Turkey, obviously Turkey is a very up and coming, very fast growth region, which is not getting enough attention here in the Valley and in the United States. So meeting Emrah is also a chance to build out your network in Istanbul and Ankara. So thank you very much. We'll see you next Monday.